Welcome, folks. This is all minus one story time with your favorite host, Bill. How are we doing today? The release of this video is March 18th, 2021. It's a Thursday. It's very rainy here in this little nook and cranny of West Virginia that I live in. So, being a Thursday at this time, we have been reading Nihilism and the Roots of the Revolution of the Modern Age by Eugene Rose, or Father Seraphim Rose. So, let's get into it. We left off at this portion right here, the stage of nihilistic dialectic. The nihilist mentality and the unity of its underlying aim is single. But this mentality manifests itself in phenomenon as diverse as the nature of the men who share it. The single nihilist cause is thus advanced on many fronts simultaneously, and its enemies are confused and deceived by the effective tactic. To the careful observer, however, nihilist phenomena reduce themselves to 3 or 4 principal types, and these few types are further related to each other as stages in a process which may be called the nihilist dialectic. One stage of nihilism opposes itself to another, not to combat it effectively, but to incorporate its errors into its own program and carry mankind one step further on the road to the abyss that lies at the end of all nihilism. The arguments at each stage, to be sure, are often effective in pointing out certain obvious differences of a preceding or successive stage, but no circumstance is ever radical enough to touch on the common errors all stages share and partial truths which are admittedly present in all forms of nihilism, are in the end only tactics to seduce men into greater falsehood that underlies them all. So, a mouthful is the first paragraph as Father Rose's way of writing. But essentially he's saying, hey, this can be broken down pretty simple into 3 or 4 principal types, he says right here. And he says they are related to each other as stages in a process. The dialectic being, of course, speaking this forth in their ability to rationalize it. It says one stage opposes itself to the next. So they're always conflicting. Again, this goes back to postmodernist thinking, because postmodernist thinking is just a fancy way of essentially saying nihilism. Deconstructionism, like critical theory, and the postmodernist deconstruction is all meant to demoralize guys. It is utterly to demoralize any form of logic, and it's a form of antichrist. And in that, Paul says, John says that no man that claims that Christ didn't come in the flesh is antichrist. He's talking about the Gnostics of the day, because that's what the Gnostics taught. When we apply some of the other things he talks about, we can see that Antichrist, as he said, was already there. It was a spirit of the day. So, we often think of this as a figure or a person, but we have to think spiritually, and spiritually it is an attitude. All right, the Antichrist attitude. And if Christ is the logic and the reason for all of existence, then whatever is antithetical to that is the Antichrist. And that's what nihilism is. And that's what this dialectic that he's talking about is about. They contradict each other. That's what postmodernists do. And it's all to demoralize you, which is what nihilism does. It says, not to combat it effectively, but to incorporate its errors into its own program and carry mankind one step further to the road to the abyss that lies at the end of all nihilism. And again, I could reread the entire thing. I don't think I should. I should just keep moving, but I just kind of wanted to break that down and you all to make those connections there. The stage to be described in the following pages are not to be understood as merely chronological, though in the narrowest sense they are in fact a kind of chronicle of the development of nihilist mentality from the time of the failure of the nihilist experiment of the French Revolution. Again, the era, the ushering in of the modern age. That was essentially the end of the age of Enlightenment. Industrialism was coming then. And this is the worldview we have taken, that things began at the French Revolution. Things began at the Enlightenment. We forget to go back to the Renaissance. And then before that, during what we call the Dark Ages in Europe, there were still things moving and governments forming and the Magna Carta being written and whatever else. So we can't just stop. It has to go back even further. And then we go all the way back, of course, to the Roman Empire and Christianity's influence. And then before that, we can look at, of course, Greek philosophers and whatever else. But we have to understand, we didn't just come out of nowhere. This was built over time for us. And what he is saying, but for them, it starts with the French Revolution, which is par for the course for how the intellectuals think. And again, the postmodernists do this. It's called postmodernism because we've moved past the modern age, that is the industrial era, into something completely new and different. And the newness and differentness is just absolute nihilism. It's insanity. All right. Let's get back here to where we were at. Development of nihilist mentality from the time of its failure of the nihilist experiment of the French Revolution to the rise and fall of the latest and most explicitly nihilist manifestation of the revolution, National Socialism. He's talking about fascism, the fasci. Thus, the two decades before and the two after the middle of the 19th century may be seen as the summit of liberal prestige and influence. As J.S. Mill and other typical liberal, the age of realism occupies perhaps the last half of the century and is exemplified on the one hand by socialist thinkers. On the other hand, the philosophers and popularizers, we should perhaps rather say exploiters of science, vitalism, in the forms of symbolism, occultism, artistic expressionism, and various evolutionary and mystical philosophies, is the most significant intellectual undercurrent throughout the half century after about 1875. And the nihilism of destruction through its intellectual roots lie deep in the preceding centuries, brings to a grand conclusion in the public order as well as in many private spheres the whole century and quarter of nihilist development, with a concentrated era of destruction from 1914 to 1945. That would be the progressive era, ladies and gentlemen. The progressive era was that era from 1914 to 1945. It was actually rising a little bit before that, but that really would have been the crux of it in the United States. So what are we looking at here? He's talking about National Socialism. That is what we called fascism. It's what the Nazis were. Here, really interestingly, I bring this up often, the symbolism and occultism. We're talking about things like Freemasonry. We're talking about things like Alice A. Bailey, which I bring up often, or H.P. Blavatsky, Aleister Crowley, who was a, early 20th century Satanist, if you would. It's quite popular, quite influential all throughout the government and intellectual artistic spheres. The artistic expressionism, all of this stuff, and the various evolutionary and mythical philosophies, or mystical philosophies, the New Age, if you would, all of this was coming about. When I talk about the one world government being formed and ordered, that is all part of it. That is all part of it. It really is. These same people in these same spheres were talking about this. This is where these ideas and these things are coming from. It's quite interesting that these mystics were saying that they got this from, demons or angels or the like, that they channeled it. Of course, they could have been full of it. They could have been on drugs. They could have been in some sort of altered state. Those things might not exist, but it is interesting that they attribute those things to providing them with the secret information. And yeah, I mean, he sums that up well right here, talking about that. And again, I bring these things up because they're not talked about. I mean, yes, they're talked about in like the conspiracy world, but they're not talked about by regular Joe that often. Some people talk about it, but I have this knowledge. I've been studying this stuff for 15 years, man, and I'll tell you, it's interesting because you can see this train of thought go backward, and it always goes back to that kind of Satanistic idealism, which is what I was talking about being Antichrist in that first paragraph. It will be noticed that these periods overlap. For nihilism matures at a different rate in different peoples and in different individuals. The overlap, in fact, is more extreme than our simple scheme can suggest. So much so that representatives of every stage can be found in every period, and all of them exist contemporaneously even today. What is true of historical periods is true also of individuals. There is no such thing as a pure nihilist at any stage, every predominantly nihilist temperament being a combination of at least two of the stages. That's interesting. I'm definitely interested to see what he has to say about that. So, but I would suggest this in almost any sort of ideology, that yes, there are going to be overlaps, and almost no one is completely 100% dedicated to their ideology. And if they are not a person. They are the ideology. Their ideology has become their persona. And in case you aren't aware, the persona is the idea that Carl Jung placed out there, that the things the world projects upon you, you take on in a mask, and you only show that to the world. That's the persona, the outer self. But there is a deeper inner self. One of the part of that inner self is the shadow, which is your dark side. That's the thing that tends to project everything. But the one that comes before that's the ego. And egotism protects, it's just a little bit more deep than that persona, but it kind of protects the shadow if it's not well developed, and hides it. And then, of course, there's the anima and the animus, and that is your very sexual nature, your very being, your gendered being. And we can see how horrible society has gotten, and how out of place, and how much persona we are. And those genders are so confused. I've done videos on this in the past, so you guys can go check that out. Maybe I'll link it at the end here. I'll go searching for them. So what do we have? Further, if the age since the French Revolution is the first one to which nihilism has played the central role, each of its stages has been represented in earlier centuries. Liberalism, for example, is a direct derivative of Renaissance humanism. Yes, this is why Machiavelli was more or less a liberal, a classical liberal. Realism was an important aspect of the Protestant Reformation, as well as the French Enlightenment. A kind of vitalicism appeared in the Renaissance and Enlightenment occultism, and again in Romanticism. Yes, but there was that going on before. There was a height of alchemy around that time, and then kind of went away for more what we would call hard sciences. Although I would suggest that alchemy outside of its spiritual philosophical realm was a form of chemistry. It just was a very archaic form and not very scientific. So regardless, if you're playing with stuff, trying to make stuff, and understanding that certain things react in certain ways, you're developing some form of science, right? We don't call it that today because we like to be all high-minded and snooty about how the how the ancient world was, because we must be better. We even call ourselves, I forget when this developed, but we even think of ourselves, at least civilized man in any form, as Homo sapiens sapiens. We are the wise man. Homo sapien meaning man. If you haven't heard that, I don't know when we entered into the double sapiens, but we double sapiened up a while ago, folks. We're super smart, super smart. Just like we're super straight here, super smart and super straight. Okay, let's get back here. It says Enlightenment, occultism, and again, and Romanticism, and the nihilism of destruction, while never thorough as it has been for the past century, has existed as temptation for certain extremist thinkers throughout the modern age. With these reservations, however, our scheme may perhaps be accepted as at least an approximation of what has been an untenable historical and psychological process. Let us then begin our investigation of the stages of this process, the nihilist dialectic, attempting to judge them by the clear light of the Orthodox Christian truth, which, if we are correct, they exist to obscure and deny. In this section, we shall attempt no more than to describe these stages, to point out by reference to the definition of nihilism we have adopted, and what respect they may be characterized as nihilists. So we will come back to that. A little shorter video, guys, shorter than my quick shot today, but that was packed with a lot of info itself. So yeah, this looks quite long. So we will come back to that, guys. Perhaps I will try to get another recording out before the end of the day, or maybe tomorrow if I get a chance, because I do have some things to do. And with that, maybe I'll release it on Saturday or something. So again, it'll get things pushed up a little bit. But yeah, guys, every time I turn this thing on, I start reading and I'm like, yep. Not that I would have thrown this out of hand if I read this 15 years ago either, but this is like a little treatise on, and we're about a quarter, nearly a third of the way through. So this is like a little treatise of, what's going on with the world spiritually. And from a philosophical perspective, from the words of a guy who was obviously very bright, was a philosopher himself. We are seeing these predictions and projections from him and historical context from a 1960s perspective, but we can look at it today, 60 years later, and go, yeah, look at what has happened to our society. And this guy probably had no idea how bad things were going to get, right? But that's about it, guys. This has been another reading of Nihilism, the Root of the Revolution of the Modern Age. And you have been watching All Minus One Storytime with your favorite host, Bill. Hey, guys, I wish you all well.